Stop whatever you are doing for the next few minutes, because if you are running Windows 11 right now, there is a combination of things happening simultaneously to that operating system that you genuinely need to understand before you close this video and go back to whatever you were doing. This is not a routine technology update video. This is not a list of minor annoyances. Right now, in the middle of 2026, Windows 11 is dealing with active nation-state cyber attacks exploiting incomplete patches. A wave of monthly updates that are breaking BitLocker encryption and causing boot failures, a hidden AI feature that takes screenshots of everything on your screen without most users knowing it exists, and an update failure pattern so consistent that Microsoft has had to issue emergency out-of-band fixes multiple months in a row just to keep the operating system functioning the way it is supposed to. Every single one of these things is documented, confirmed by Microsoft itself or by independent security researchers, and actively affecting machines right now. None of this is speculation, none of this is exaggerated for the sake of a dramatic headline, and none of this requires you to be a cybersecurity professional, an IT administrator, or a power user to understand. If you turn on a Windows 11 computer at any point this week, some part of what is described in this video applies directly to you. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what is happening, why it matters, and the specific actions you need to take today to protect yourself, your files, and the information stored on your machine. The reason this particular moment matters so much is that these stories are not isolated from each other. They compound. A vulnerability that a foreign intelligence agency is actively exploiting gets patched, and the patch itself introduces a new problem, a monthly security update that is mandatory for protection against that same kind of attack simultaneously breaks disk encryption recovery for an unrelated group of users. A privacy-invasive AI feature ships quietly while the conversation around update failures dominates the headlines, meaning fewer people notice it before it is already active on their machine. Each of these stories on its own might be dismissed as a one-off inconvenience taken together across a single 6-month window. They describe something much larger, an operating system under sustained pressure from outside attackers and from its own update process at the same time, with most ordinary users never seeing the full picture because each story gets reported separately, in isolation, by different outlets on different days, without anyone connecting them into the single continuous narrative you are about to hear right now. Let us start with the most serious issue because it involves a foreign intelligence agency actively exploiting Windows right now in real attacks against real targets using a vulnerability that Microsoft itself failed to properly fix the first time. In February 2026, Microsoft's Patch Tuesday release disclosed 6 actively exploited zero-day vulnerabilities. Security researchers at Akamai, led by senior researcher Meir Dahan, detected that Russia's military intelligence unit, tracked under the name Zapt-28, Fancy Bear, Forest Blizzard, and Sophacy, was actively exploiting one of those vulnerabilities, tracked as CV2026215110, in real attacks against Ukraine. And European Union member states, the attack began with a phishing email disguised to look like it came from Ukraine's Hydrometeorological Center, a piece of seemingly mundane government infrastructure communication that victims would have no reason to suspect. The email contained a weaponized shortcut file, a file format more commonly known as nlink file, exploiting a separate vulnerability tracked as CV2026215113, a security feature bypass in Microsoft's MSHML rendering framework, by chaining. These two vulnerabilities together, the Russian intelligence operatives were able to bypass Microsoft's Defender smart screen protection entirely and remotely execute malicious code on victims' computers, all triggered by something as simple as a user opening what looked like an ordinary shortcut file attached to an email. Microsoft patched both of these vulnerabilities in February 2026's Patch Tuesday release. This should have ended the story. It did not. Akamai's security researchers, while independently testing whether Microsoft's February patch had actually closed the hole, discovered something that should alarm every single Windows user paying attention to this story. While testing the patch systems, the researchers noticed that a victim machine was still authenticating to the attacker's server even after the patch had been applied. Microsoft's fix had successfully prevented the original remote code execution and the smart screen bypass, but the patch left behind an entirely new vulnerability. A zero-click authentication coercion flaw that Akamai cataloged as CV202632202. This new vulnerability requires absolutely no user interaction whatsoever. It does not require a victim to open a file, click a link, or take any action at all. It can be exploited remotely, silently, to coerce a Windows machine into authenticating to an attacker-controlled server and surrendering credentials in the process. Microsoft marked this new vulnerability as exploitation detected, and the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, added it to the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog, setting a hard deadline of May 12, 2026, for every federal agency in the country to apply the fix. Think carefully about what that timeline actually represents, because it is genuinely one of the more alarming patterns in recent Windows security history. A nation-state intelligence agency identified and exploit today. Vulnerability against government and infrastructure targets. Microsoft, once alerted, patched it. Independent researchers, simply doing routine verification testing of that patch rather than searching for anything new, discovered that the patch itself had created a second, more dangerous vulnerability, one requiring zero user interaction at all, the single hardest category of vulnerability for any ordinary user to defend against through caution or awareness alone. That second vulnerability was then also confirmed under active exploitation before most ordinary users had even learned about the first one. This is precisely the kind of cascading security failure that should make every Windows 11 user stop assuming that installing updates automatically means they are fully protected the moment the installation finishes. Updates close known gaps. They do not guarantee that no new gap has opened in the process of closing the old one. And the only way researchers and Microsoft discover that is through continuous, ongoing testing after the fact testing that, in this case, took weeks to surface a problem that attackers may have already been aware of and exploiting in parallel. April 2026's Patch Tuesday release continued this troubling pattern at an even larger scale. Microsoft fixed 167 separate vulnerabilities in a single update cycle, a number so large that independent security researchers described the release as significantly larger than average, with a disproportionately high number of fixes affecting core Windows components rather than peripheral features. Of those 167 vulnerabilities, 2 were 0 days, meaning they were either actively being exploited in the wild or had been publicly disclosed before Microsoft had a chance to ship a fix. The most critical of these was a Microsoft SharePoint server spoofing vulnerability, tracked as CV202632201, which was confirmed to be under active exploitation at the time the patch released. For any organization running SharePoint for internal document management and collaboration, and a substantial percentage of mid-size and large businesses around the world do exactly that, this represented an immediate, confirmed, real-world risk requiring emergency remediation, not a routine maintenance task to get to eventually. The April release also addressed 8 separate vulnerabilities rated as critical severity, the highest classification Microsoft assigns, and 7 of those 8 were remote code execution flaws, the most dangerous category of vulnerability that exists, because remote code execution means an attacker can run their own code on your machine without needing physical access to it or any cooperation from you beyond, in some cases, simply being connected to the same network. Among these critical flaws were a Windows TCP or IP remote code execution vulnerability and a Windows Active Directory remote code execution vulnerability, both of which security researchers specifically flagged as alarming because they can be exploited at the network level without any user interaction under certain configurations. A vulnerability that requires 0 clicks, 0 downloads, and 0 mistakes from the person using the computer is the single most dangerous category of security flaw that exists, because there is no behavioral safeguard a careful user can apply to protect themselves. The only protection is the patch itself being installed, and the threat did not stop with what Microsoft fixed in April. Security firm Huntress reported that their Security Operations Center was actively observing exploitation techniques being used in the wild that they internally codenamed Bluehammer, Redson, and Undefend, discovered as part of a broader campaign Huntress refers to as Nightmare Eclipse. Microsoft did track and patch the Bluehammer vulnerability as CV202633825 in the April update cycle, but the other two exploitation techniques, Redson and Undefend, remained completely unaddressed at the time of reporting. Huntress documented that attackers using the Redson technique could gain full system level privileges, the highest level of access on a Windows machine on Windows 10, Windows 11, and Windows Server systems, specifically when Windows Defender, Microsoft's own built-in antivirus protection, was enabled and active. The mechanism exploited a flaw in how Windows Defender handled files tagged as coming from cloud storage. When Defender detected that a malicious file carried a cloud tag, the antivirus software designed specifically to protect your computer would, for reasons researchers described as almost absurd, rewrite the malicious file back to disk in a way that enabled the attack to proceed. The very software meant to protect Windows users was being turned into a tool that facilitated the attack it was supposed to prevent. Huntress also documented evidence of hands-on keyboard threat actor activity, meaning a real human attacker actively operating inside a compromised network in real time, not an automated script running unsupervised after a breach that began through a compromised SSL VPN account. Like and subscribe right now, because what comes next in this video is just as important and affects an even larger number of ordinary users who have nothing to do with enterprise networks or nation-state attackers, beyond the security vulnerabilities being actively exploited by sophisticated attackers. Windows 11e's own monthly update process has become a genuine source of risk and disruption all on its own, independent of any external attacker. In April 2026, Microsoft confirmed that its own security updates were triggering BitLocker recovery mode on an unknown but significant number of devices. BitLocker is Windows' built-in disk encryption feature designed to protect your data if your device is lost or stolen by making the entire drive unreadable without the correct recovery key. When BitLocker recovery mode triggers unexpectedly after a routine update, users are presented with a screen demanding a 48-character recovery key before their computer will boot at all, a key that the vast majority of ordinary users have never written down, never backed up anywhere accessible, and have no idea how to retrieve. For users who do not have that key saved somewhere, or who never set up the backup process correctly when BitLocker was originally enabled, this single bug can mean total, permanent loss of access to every file on the device, with no path to recovery whatsoever. Microsoft also confirmed in the same update cycle that these same April 2026 security updates were causing failures in third-party backup applications that relied on a specific vulnerable driver, meaning that even the backup software some users were relying on as a safety net against exactly this kind of catastrophe was simultaneously being broken by the same update wave. The pattern continued directly into May 2026. Microsoft confirmed that the May 2026 security update, tracked as KB50895549, was failing to install on a meaningful number of devices, triggering an error code OX80OF0922. According to Microsoft's own technical documentation, the failures occurred specifically during the reboot phase of installation, consistently around 35 to 36% completion, and were caused by insufficient free space on something called the FI system partition, a small hidden partition that Windows creates automatically during installation and uses to store the critical boot files that allow your computer's firmware to actually start Windows in the first place. Devices with 10 megabytes or less of free space remaining in this partition were the most likely to fail. Here is the part that should genuinely concern you. This partition is completely hidden from File Explorer by default, specifically because it is considered too sensitive and critical for ordinary users to interact with directly. That means an ordinary Windows 11 user, looking at their computer's storage in the normal way, would see plenty of free space available on their main drive and have absolutely no way of knowing that a separate, invisible, several hundred megabyte partition buried in their system was the actual cause of their update. Failing and rolling back with the generic and unhelpful message, something didn't go as planned, undoing changes. Microsoft did mitigate the immediate symptom through what is called a known issue rollback for most consumer and unmanaged business devices, and the company eventually shipped a more permanent fix in a later optional update, recommending a registry edit as a workaround for anyone still affected. A fix that explicitly comes with Microsoft's own warning that editing the Windows registry incorrectly can cause irreversible damage to your entire installation, and that you should back up your full system before attempting it. This was not an isolated month. Earlier in 2026, January's Patch Tuesday release, which fixed more than 100 vulnerabilities, simultaneously introduced its own set of serious regressions. Microsoft confirmed that remote desktop connections were failing for users specifically at the credential prompt stage, completely blocking access to cloud PCs and Azure. Virtual desktop sessions for remote workers who depended on that connectivity for their actual jobs. The same update cycle also introduced a shutdown bug on Windows 11 23H2 systems that prevented affected machines from powering off correctly through the normal Start menu shutdown command, forcing some power users to rely on a command prompt workaround just to turn their computers off properly until Microsoft shipped an emergency out-of-band patch to fix the regression. Separately, users reported that the classic Outlook application was freezing after installing the same update, an issue that remained under investigation for an extended period without an immediate resolution. March 2026's update cycle had its own headline problem. Microsoft confirmed that update was breaking user sign-in for an unspecified set of affected devices, another regression serious enough to require its own dedicated fix communicated through Microsoft's official release health documentation. April's update separately triggered widespread community reports independently corroborated across enthusiast forums and technology publications of noticeably slower boot times, sluggish overall system performance compared to behavior before the update, random freezes, and complete system hangs requiring a hard reboot to recover. From occasional full blue screen of death crashes, particularly during gaming sessions or other demanding workloads, and intermittent driver compatibility problems affecting specific peripherals. Some technology creators and enthusiast communities went so far as to actively recommend that users hold off on installing that particular update where their work or personal situation allowed for any flexibility, given how disruptive the documented side effects were proving to be for a meaningful share of the people who installed it. Stepping back and looking at this pattern across just the first 6 months of 2026 alone, you can see something that goes well beyond the normal, expected friction of software maintenance. January introduced remote desktop failures and a shutdown regression. February disclosed 6 actively exploited 0 days in a single release. March broke sign-in for some users. April fixed 167 vulnerabilities, including a SharePoint 0-day under active exploitation, while simultaneously triggering BitLocker recovery failures, breaking third-party backup software, and causing widespread performance complaints serious enough that creators were telling their audiences to consider delaying installation. May's mandatory security update failed to install correctly on devices with constrained FI partition space, an issue invisible to ordinary users through any normal interface that Microsoft needed an entire additional update cycle to properly resolve. This is not a story about one bad month. This is a 6-month-long, continuously documented pattern of an operating system whose monthly security delivery process is simultaneously necessary for protection against real, active nation-state level threats and consistently introducing new, separate problems as a direct side effect of delivering that protection. Like and subscribe right now, because the next part of this story moves away from update bugs and 0-day exploits and into something that affects your privacy specifically, every Single day, whether or not you have ever heard of it before this moment. There is a feature built directly into Windows 11 in 2026 called Copilot Vision, and independent technology journalism investigating it throughout the year has specifically used the phrase that Microsoft is hiding Windows 11e's eyes. Copilot Vision is a capability that allows Microsoft's Copilot AI assistant to see and analyze what is currently displayed on your screen, not through a one-time manual screenshot you choose to share, but as an ongoing capability that can be invoked to observe your active screen content in order to answer questions, provide contextual assistance, or take suggested actions based on what you are currently looking at. Think about the practical implications of a feature like this existing on a machine where you do your banking, where you read private messages from family members, where you handle work documents under confidentiality agreements, or where you manage medical or legal information. The feature is marketed as a productivity enhancement, and for some specific use cases it genuinely can function that way. But the framing of the feature as a convenience does nothing to change what it technically is: a capability with direct access to whatever is rendered on your display at any given moment. The investigative reporting into this feature found that the controls for fully understanding, managing, and completely removing this capability are not prominently surfaced in Windows 11e's main settings interface in the way you would expect for a feature with this level of access to your visual screen content. Finding where Copilot Vision lives, understanding exactly what it can see and for how long, and fully disabling or removing it requires navigating through settings paths that are not obvious, are not heavily advertised, and require the kind of dedicated technical investigation that produced entire published guides specifically dedicated to walking users through the process of locating and eliminating it. This is a meaningfully different design choice than how a privacy-conscious feature rollout would typically be handled, where the expected approach would be a clear, single prominent toggle presented to the user the very first time the feature becomes available on their machine, with a plain language explanation of exactly what data the feature accesses and for what purpose, rather than a capability that quietly activates and requires the user to go searching specifically for the means to turn it off. This sits within a much broader pattern that has defined Windows 11e's AI feature rollout throughout 2025 and into 2026. Capabilities with significant access to your personal data, your files, your screen content, and your usage patterns being introduced, often enabled by default or with non-obvious opt-out mechanisms, while the actual settings needed to fully understand or disable those capabilities are buried, split across multiple separate menus, or simply not where a reasonable person would expect to look for them. Windows Recall, the screenshot-based AI memory feature that takes continuous captures of your screen activity and makes them searchable, went through its own well-documented controversy earlier in this same cycle, requiring Microsoft to delay its rollout multiple times and substantially redesign its security architecture after researchers found the original implementation stored screenshot data in plain, unencrypted text. Copilot Vision represents the next iteration of this same underlying design philosophy. AI features with deep access to what is happening on your screen, introduced as a forward-looking convenience, with the actual controls over your own privacy positioned as something you have to actively go looking for rather than something presented to you clearly and upfront at the moment the feature first becomes active on your machine. So what should you actually do with all of this information? Here is a clear, practical set of actions that directly addresses everything covered in this video. First, and this is non-negotiable regardless of anything else in this list, install your Windows updates. Despite every documented bug, every BitLocker failure, and every installation error covered here, the security patches themselves are addressing real, actively exploited vulnerabilities being used by sophisticated attackers, including confirmed nation-state intelligence operations right now. The solution to update-related bugs is not avoiding updates entirely that leaves you exposed to the original vulnerabilities, which are demonstrably worse and being actively exploited in the wild against real targets. The solution is installing updates promptly while taking sensible precautions around the process itself. Second, before installing any major monthly update, create a full backup of your important files to an external drive or a separate cloud storage location that is not dependent on the device you are updating. Given the documented pattern of BitLocker recovery failures, boot partition issues, and update rollback problems throughout 2025 and 2026, having your critical files backed up completely independently of your primary device removes the single greatest risk, permanent unrecoverable data loss if an update goes wrong on your specific hardware configuration. Third, and this is something the vast majority of Windows 11 users have never done, locate and securely save your BitLocker recovery key right now. Before you need it in an emergency, not after. Open Settings, navigate to Privacy and Security, then Device Encryption, and look for the option to back up your recovery key. You can save it to your Microsoft account online, print a physical copy and store it somewhere secure, or save it to a USB drive kept separately from your computer. If a future update triggers an unexpected BitLocker recovery prompt the way April 2026's updates did for some users, having this key already saved and accessible is the difference between a brief inconvenience and a complete permanent loss of access to every file on your machine. Fourth, take 10 minutes today to actually find and review the Copilot Vision settings, along with the broader Copilot and Recall related privacy settings on your machine. Go into Settings, then Privacy and Security, and methodically work through every section related to AI features, diagnostic data, activity history, and screen content. Access. If you decide that a feature with the ability to see and process your screen's contents is not something you want active on your device, take the time to fully disable it rather than assuming that turning off a single visible toggle has removed every related component running in the background. Fifth, if you are running a business, a home office with sensitive client or financial data, or any environment where a SharePoint deployment, remote desktop connectivity, or VPN access is part of your daily workflow, treat the specific vulnerabilities covered in this video the SharePoint spoofing flaw, the remote desktop credential prompt failures, the VPN-related breach vectors documented by Huntress as immediate priorities for your IT team or your own personal review, not items to address during your next regularly scheduled maintenance window. The nation-state attackers covered in this video, specifically the Russian Apt-28 group, are documented as actively targeting government-adjacent infrastructure and businesses across Ukraine and the European Union right now. And the techniques used in those documented attacks are not exclusive to those specific regions or to government targets alone once they are publicly understood and reverse-engineered by other threat actors. Sixth, if Windows Defender is your primary or only line of antivirus defense on your machine, understand clearly that the Redson exploitation technique documented by Huntress specifically targets a flaw in how Defender handles certain cloud-tagged files, and consider this as one additional factor among several in evaluating whether a layered security approach, potentially including a reputable secondary security tool, careful attention to email attachments and shortcut files from unknown senders, and disciplined use of network-level protections makes sense for your specific situation, particularly if you handle sensitive financial, medical, business, or legal information on the device in question. None of these 6 steps requires specialized technical training, expensive software, or more than about 30 minutes of your time combined. What they require is simply doing them today while the information in this video is fresh, rather than filing it away as something to get to eventually. Here is the honest, complete picture that emerges when you put all of this together. Windows 11 in 2026 is simultaneously one of the most actively targeted operating systems on the planet precisely because of how widely deployed it is, and one of the most actively patched and defended precisely because Microsoft has enormous resources dedicated to discovering and fixing vulnerabilities as quickly as they are found. Both of these things are true at the same time, and they exist in genuine, ongoing tension with each other. The same update process that delivered a critical fix for an actively exploited SharePoint vulnerability in April 2026 also broke BitLocker for some users and damaged third-party backup software in that exact same release. The same monthly cadence that is closing zero-day vulnerabilities discovered by Akamai is also the cadence that has, multiple times in 2026 alone, required emergency out-of-band follow-up patches just to fix the problems the original patches introduced. This is not a reason to abandon Windows 11, switch operating systems out of panic, or stop installing updates. It is a reason to engage with your own computer's security and update process with significantly more awareness, intention, and preparation than most people currently do, because the stakes on both sides of this equation, the threat from sophisticated attackers and the risk from the update process meant to defend against them, are genuinely higher right now than they have been in years. It is worth pausing on why this is happening now in 2026 specifically, rather than treating it as simply how software has always worked. Microsoft itself has acknowledged that the sheer volume of vulnerability discovery has increased substantially, with the company's own security leadership noting that engineers and the broader security research community are increasingly using AI-assisted tools to examine software more thoroughly and more frequently than was practical even a few years ago. Microsoft has fixed more than 500 CV-tracked vulnerabilities in 2026 alone by the middle of the year, a pace that reflects both a genuinely more dangerous threat landscape and a genuinely more capable detection apparatus working to keep up with it. More vulnerabilities are being found because more sophisticated tools on both the defensive and offensive sides are looking for them. That arms race produces exactly the pattern described throughout this video: a faster pace of patches, a faster pace of newly discovered problems within those patches, and a shrinking window between when a vulnerability is found and when it is weaponized by someone with malicious intent. Understanding that broader context does not make any individual issue covered in this video less urgent, but it does explain why this is not a temporary rough patch that will simply resolve itself in a future Windows version. The pattern is structural, tied to how software security research itself is evolving, and it means the kind of vigilance described in the action steps in this video is not a short-term fix, but a long-term habit worth building into how you use your computer every single month going forward. You now know about the active Russian intelligence exploitation of an incompletely patched Windows vulnerability, confirmed by independent researchers and added to a federal government's mandatory remediation list. You know about the 167 vulnerabilities fixed in a single April update, including a SharePoint zero-day under live attack and a set of critical remote code execution flaws affecting core networking components. You know about the BitLocker recovery failures, the FI partition update errors that hid behind a generic and unhelpful error message, the shutdown bugs that forced power users back to the command line, and the sign-in failures that have hit Windows 11 in consecutive months throughout 2026. You know about Copilot Vision and the broader pattern of AI features with deep access to your screen content arriving with privacy controls that are deliberately difficult to locate, buried across multiple settings menus rather than presented clearly at the moment the feature first activates, and you know exactly what to do about every single one of these issues, starting today in the next 10 minutes before you close this video and move on with the rest of your day. The single most important takeaway from everything covered here is not any one specific vulnerability or any one specific bug. It is the recognition that running Windows 11 safely in 2026 requires a level of active, ongoing attention that simply installing updates and trusting the process no longer fully provides on its own. The threats are real and sophisticated, the defenses are real and constantly evolving, and the gap between the two, the window where something can go wrong on either side, is where the practical steps covered in this video make the actual difference between a brief inconvenience and a genuine, lasting problem. If this video gave you something you genuinely needed to know about the computer you are using right now, drop a comment below telling me which part surprised you the most. And if you have not yet backed up your BitLocker recovery key after watching this, stop, go do that right now, and then come back and hit that like button and subscribe, because there is a lot more coverage like this coming, and the pace of what is happening with Windows 11 security right now means you genuinely cannot afford to miss the next update in this story.